Okay, great. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. And before we get started, I just want to make a couple quick announcements. Nicole and I have been thinking a little bit about like organization. And so, I think if you're really interested in helping us organize, we would love for you to reach out to us. So that's just a quick call for that. And I'd also really love for you to follow us on Mastodon. That's where we've been essentially doing the equivalent of tweeting. For the most part, a lot of our social media has moved over there since kind of everything has gone down on Twitter. So I just wanted to promote our social media. You can also follow us on YouTube. So we'd of course appreciate either of those. And if you're not on our email list, you should join. The survey on our website is how you can get your email added to our email list. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Noam Ross. Dr. Ross is a principal scientist for computational research at EcoHealth Alliance, a global nonprofit working at the nexus of conservation and human health. He also serves as a software peer review lead at rOpenSci, a developer collective building technical and social infrastructure for open science in the R language. Noam's biological work focuses on applied and theoretical forecasting of zoonotic disease emergence, understanding disease circulation in wildlife populations and in wildlife-human contact processes, and study design for One Health research. His computational work includes building inclusiveness and diversity in the scientific software ecosystem, review and validation of scientific and statistical software, as well as reproducible computing environments. He holds a PhD in ecology from the University of California, Davis. So without further ado, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Christian and Nicole, for inviting me here and everybody for coming. I see some familiar names and avatars in the audience here. Glad everybody is here. So today, I'm going to talk about tools and teams for reproducible science with R. As I was just telling Christian and Nicole, this is my first time giving this talk. It's sort of exploring some new ideas and concepts. As I told them, one of the things I'm interested in doing is in my organizations is rolling out our process as product and thinking about how we do things can be part of what we do and what we communicate. And so this talk is something about that. Before I dive into it, I want to give a little bit of background of where I'm coming from and why these are the things I work on. So as Christian's great introduction said, I'm principal scientist for computational research at EcoHealth Alliance. EcoHealth is a nonprofit research institution. We like to call ourselves a think and do tank. We're based in New York, and we work on a variety of topics related to wildlife conservation and human health, a very big part of which is studying wildlife diseases and zoonotic disease emergence. We work in over 30 countries, and we have a highly interdisciplinary team of biologists, veterinarians, computational researchers, data scientists, policy experts that all collaborate. And so part of what I'm presenting today is how we think about this type of work in the context of that interdisciplinary type of work. And we really focus on research that has an impact and how to make that research have an impact. There's another hat that I wear. I'm the software peer review lead and part of the leadership team for rOpenSci. rOpenSci is a community organization primarily around promoting reproducible and open science, primarily through tools in the R language. And we do that through building technical infrastructure, be that validation tools, R packages, new development tools, and community infrastructure of linking together research software engineers, building inclusiveness for those software engineers, finding more opportunities to develop the open science ecosystem collaboratively. So most of my R user talks are actually often very heavily in the rOpenSci hat, but today's talk is going to be much more on the EcoHealth Alliance hat here. So the inspiration from this talk emerges from a paper that some of you might be familiar with called Good Enough Practices in Scientific Computing. This is a paper written by Greg Wilson, who founded the Carpentries, the organization that runs software carpentry and data carpentry workshops. Jennifer and a number of other people involved, particularly in the Carpentries and other training approaches for reproducibility and computational research. And they actually wrote many versions of this over the past decade, but a good representation of it is this paper that's in PLOS Computational Biology called Good Enough Practices in Scientific Computing. And Good Enough Practices in Scientific Computing is really a set of basic guidelines for how people should pursue their project management and their research approaches so that their work is ultimately fair. So fair is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. And within the context of software and this context of computer code being used for scientific research, that reproducible is the really big part. And so the idea here was to set a baseline of guidance, which is very much in parallel with the skills that are taught in those software carpentry research workshops, to say, these are sort of the basics of what you want to do for your individual projects, ranging from how you do data management to how you record the scientific software or code that you develop, how you produce documentation to collaborate, how one organizes a project so it can be navigated by yourself and others in the future, how you track changes, and how you publish. And together, this has sort of formed something of a common practice that between the Carpentries and lots of other data science and reproducible and other training programs talk about how one should manage one's own research when one is doing work that has a computational component. And there's a kind of good enough toolkit that has emerged. It is not language exclusive. This is an R user group, right? So I will talk about R in this context. And so it's composed of having a scriptable workflow, something that you can use such as R or Python or Julia or another data science or computational language. Tools to work in and support that language like RStudio, a project structure approach of how you organize your files, usually a version control approach, so you can look at the history of your work going forwards and backwards in different versions. Git and GitHub have become the overwhelming dominant forces within that. A mechanism for publication and development of often literate code or reproducible documents in the R context has historically been R Markdown or more recently Quarto, and a publishing approach and a publishing platform. And so repositories for your software or your data, such as Zenodo, or in some cases, the more accessible but less archival ones, such as GitHub. And this has formed kind of the square of, this is the good enough toolkit. This is what you should be doing if all researchers could sort of bring their work up to a place where they were following these general practices and using tools like this or similar to this in other languages or frameworks. That would form sort of a basis of reproducibility. But I was having a conversation with Greg Wilson and talking about some of the challenges his organization and my organization faced. And a thing he said was, you know, the good enough toolkit is good enough for the base of the type of work that many of us do, but it's not necessarily good enough when one scales up from an individual workflow to an organizational workflow, because most of the skills that are taught and the perspective as how to use those tools that's developed is often around the idea of you're an individual researcher or a small team of researchers that are users of those tools. And either that's a closed system in which you are doing those things, or you have a small set of collaborators. But fundamentally, It's a small team, an individualistic view that says, use these tools and you can go forward, right? There's often friction with collaborating with others because they might have a different set of tools, but fundamentally, these are the tools and your correct tools. But a question is, how do you scale these practices to the team scale or the organization scale? And what are the tools you need to use when the fundamental unit is us? You may be in a large lab or an institute or an organization that's pursuing common goals, that has an interest in reproducible research. And you need to have tools and workflows and practices that are good for us, that are good for everybody who is working on that enterprise, be they computational or not, across the different disciplines that are involved, and then also working with the other institutions and collaborators and participants in the scientific work that you do that's outside that. And so Greg said, hey, you work at an organization that has a point of view, that you've been doing some things. Maybe you could say, well, in the development of scale and moving from my individual work to something large, to something that's more team-based and organizational, what are the things that change in that workflow? Because as a broad field in computational research, we can use case studies for that to think about what the common platforms are in a broad way. So we might think of what problems arise at the team or organizational scale for reproducible research. So how do we collaborate efficiently within and across disciplines that are working on a common problem? How do you share best practices with an organization and maintain common standards of quality? How do you reuse information and work across different projects that are going simultaneously and projects that are successional, old projects and new projects from your group and other projects? And how do you do the work of sharing while protecting the privacy and security imperatives that a research enterprise or organization has? And so those are all things that I'm trying to think about a little bit. But as I said, this is sort of a case study. I really have an N of 1 of organizations that I have experience with this kind of process and development with. So that organization is EcoHealth Alliance. And so I thought I'd give a little overview of the types of projects we're doing and the types of collaborators we have to give you the context as to why the tools we pick are the tools that we pick, and help you think about, are the types of things that you do sufficiently related to the types of things that we do and the way we're organized to be applicable in your case study. So EcoHealth Alliance is kind of like a standalone department in an academic institution, except that rather than being focused on a discipline, we're focused on a specific set of problems related to conservation and human health. So a lot of that is viral evolution, zoonotic viral disease emergence, but also things related to conservation and human health, like forestry and air quality relationships. That work extends from basic scientific work, be it in my field, sort of theoretical ecology and system dynamics. It can extend to other basic science work in, say, viral and cell biology. It has a lot of applied disease surveillance and field work. There's a lot of components that are laboratory-based and field-based. We have big computational projects and small ones. And we have a lot of applied projects where we are taking the lessons from this science and helping them become part of policy and the governance and implementation of that policy. For instance, we do a lot of work with the World Bank in thinking about how conservation projects and health development projects can relate to each other in governance. EcoHealth Alliance is based in New York. We have about 50 or 60 staff, sort of depending on sort of the ebb and flow of projects. Most of those staff are scientific. More than 60% are sort of in the various research groups. And the photos and topics here are just some of the foci of those different research groups. So we have different principal researchers who focus on different fields, but most of our work is collaborative between them. I run the computational research group, but I might collaborate with the One Health policy group on doing work with the forest ecology group on spatial analysis of conservation planning. The bat conservation biologist will work with people who work in phylogenetics and viral genomics to design viral sampling plans. The head for animal medicine is the person who is also in charge of, say, our field protocols and humane sampling practices that apply across the board. People really work from the cellular to the organismal to the ecological and the macroecological scale. So we focus on common problems, but we have a natural set of collaborators. So often when you need to reach across discipline, that person is also across the hall or on the Slack channel as well. Now, each of these groups has computational and data science expertise within it, and computational and data science needs for the types of works that they might do. So you might look at those different groups and you'll find that there's different expertise within the individuals that lead them, as well as the other members of their team. So there's people whose real focus is bioinformatics pipelines. There's people who know GIS and spatial analysis very well. My group does a lot of work on machine learning and forecasting, but also delves into natural language processing and does, again, sort of basic theoretical and mathematical ecology. Some people are really epidemiologists and have a strong familiarity with mechanistic epidemiological models in both wildlife and human populations. And then even our sort of non-research sides of the organization have data science and data workflows that are important. You know, people who are running field management have clinical data processes to deal with laboratory compliance processes. So there is that kind of expertise and need across the organization, rather than it living solely within, say, one data science hub or group that works with the rest. Also, almost all of our projects involve other external collaborators. We usually partner with field and lab teams in the various countries that we work with. It's a strong part of our organizational need and ethic to have equal partners, especially for international collaborations and North-South collaborations. And despite the interdisciplinarity of the team, there's expertise that we don't have. And so most projects we have involve collaborations with other institutions as well. And the data science needs are for a variety of different outputs. So one of the big things that we deal with are the data collection and quality assurance processes for all of the information that flows from lab and field into our servers and for analyses. So the type of work is not necessarily the analysis itself, but just processing and managing is like a considerable part of what has to happen. Then at the other end of the scale, we have stuff that is high performance computing work, that is machine learning, that is epidemiological simulation and model fitting, that is bioinformatics and genomics. And then we have a whole other side of our work that's often mixed methods. We do work that involves focus groups, qualitative interviews, and that often paired with both sampling, like in understanding how people get diseases from interacting with the animal populations that they're near, or sort of large scale anthropological or sociological survey work is part of the work that we do as well. And then all those have different outputs. We have, like most academic researchers, scientific publications, we have data publication and figure publication we have to think about, but we also have work that gets synthesized to policymakers that has to be in sort of policy relevant visualizations and syntheses. And then we have projects and products that are live dashboards, live data feeds, things that are updated regularly, be they, daily, or a product that's produced in a certain way every, 6 months or year scale. So our work sort of spans all of those. And when we're thinking about what tools we need to use that are useful across the board, those tools and processes are ones that have to capture that type of mix. So when it comes to data science in R, I was sort of looking over the things that we use. I was just doing this over the last week. I was like browsing the different project folders and repositories that we have across things. And one of the really big ones is having a common workflow language for our different projects. There's a little bit of a confusion here, which is that I wrote the common workflow language, and as I was preparing this, I realized I forgot that there is a tool specifically called Common Workflow Language. It is not this. It's just a phrase that I'm using. But the most common thing that ties our computational work together is a tool called Targets. Targets is an R package that is a build system for managing workflows and caching large computation. And it's something that emerges from a need to manage complex data science workflows that often have a very intense and long-running component that you would prefer to cache and keep results from rather than having to rerun again and again as you redo different parts of your work. But less than its ability to make you more efficient and prevent from rerunning work, it really imposes an organizational frameworks on complex multi-part projects. So using targets, which makes you develop a graph of the different components of your work, helps you organize computational pipelines in a way that they can be better understood and used. And one of the things that we have found is this has actually been tremendously adaptable and scalable across different project types. Be they sort of small one-off analyses for scientific publications, or the production of dashboards or regular high performance workloads, it's really been critical for organizing the work across different workflows that we have. It works fairly well if you're just working on a local computer. It scales well to using cloud resources or high performance compute resources. And we usually pair it with a dependency management system, usually RN, but occasionally others as well as an automation system for running a lot of things or scheduling processes, which is usually GitHub Action. And so I want to show you some examples of how we use targets at different scales. So this one is public already. This is an publication I recently put out with some colleagues in South Africa on the circulation of viruses in a population of bats in a cave in northeastern South Africa, and different coronaviruses that live in those species and the seasonality of their shedding. And it involved both a phylogenetic component and a sort of non-parametric dynamic modeling component to understand the seasonality of this virus shedding. And so the repository where we put the code for this contains a targets-defined pipeline, which is described by that small and complicated snaking graph that we put in the README of all the pieces that go in, from the raw data sources, to the processes, to the model fitting, to all the fitting generation and outputs. And so it worked really well for this flow, which was where we had a collaborator. That collaborator sent us fixed data files. We had those data files stored, and everything was just what's running on my one repository on my own machine, but it helps organize the project. But that's sort of like the smallest scale that we might use for a tool like this. But we also use it a great deal for our field and lab process management. So I will get a bit later into the systems that we use for collaborators to enter, view, and share data with us. But That happens live every day in the field as our teams are entering data in their data collection tablets, or people in the laboratories are punching information to the laboratory information management systems that they have. And we've built a variety of workflows, project by project, that ingest that data, do preliminary analysis and quality control flows, so we can see the data as it emerges from a project. So this is an example from work we are doing in Bangladesh to explore henipaviruses, including Nipah virus in that region, and understanding people's exposure to those viruses in different areas. So that involves doing survey work. So the histogram that's on the bottom there is something that's updated for us every day, and it shows the amount of time it takes to do a survey. And so we're able to sort of keep a lid on our collection processes by having sort of constant performance measures of how long does it take to do a survey, how many surveys do you do in a day. We produce a live report of where surveying is happening, so we know where our field teams are, and we can communicate, especially to funders and collaborators, what sort of the state of our data collection is, how complete the collection is at all the field sites. And then we have these quality collection flows that bring in the data from the laboratory or the surveys, and will highlight to us when there are problems with the data. The label from the test tube doesn't match anything from a field collected sample. That pops up in the QA workflow. The value is outside the range that's expected. This is a 5 kilogram bat. None of these bats are 5 kilograms large that we're sampling, something like that. There's a person whose age is recorded above or below the range that we're supposed to be collecting age. And so these are workflows that run every day, and the target system pulls in all that data, processes it, sends it through the quality control feeds, and produces reports that are emailed or posted to us individually. This has been really helpful in a lot of these field contexts. Last year, there was an outbreak of Marburg virus in Ghana, which is a rare and troubling event. And we were contracted by a government agency to go in and do a post-outbreak assessment in understanding what the potential spillover routes were, and identifying what the potential for latent infections were. And we were able to step up this whole field sampling operation in just a couple of months because of these automated workflows that let us begin the analysis as soon as the field sampling was started. The information flowed in, it was QA'd, we could see what the teams were covering, and we could see the number of records coming in, and we could start up building the structure for our outputs even before the site visits were done to make sure they were accomplishing what needed to be accomplished. The other big version of this is during 2020 and 2021, I was contracted to New York State to do outbreak analysis for COVID. And this involved building epidemiological models that ran on our high performance compute servers every night to produce dashboards for to support outbreak response and testing focus for New York State. And this is much like the other ones in that it was pulling down data, in this case from state databases that I was given access to do this work, but the same targets workflow, which is the same thing that I would use for just a paper that I might write that's doing a linear regression. We're also totally supportive of something that needed to run on our cluster on 0.5 gigabyte of RAM and 128 nodes, and would run for 8 hours with a simple scheduler, and targets handed that with aplomb. And it was essential for producing these outputs in sort of a high pace and high stake situation. Most of these things work with some type of process automation, and we use GitHub Actions as a common support for these workflow tools. So this is just a our GitHub actions themselves tend to be simple because they don't handle sort of complex dependency graphs. Those complex dependency graphs are run by targets, but they let us run things looking at parallel different versions or branches of our code and analyses, and also schedule things either to run on cloud servers, or you can also use GitHub Actions to schedule things to run on your own machines. So it can be a trigger to run something on a desktop computer, on a server, or a high performance compute node. That we found is essential not only for large jobs that are too large for sort of the standard cloud runners, but also in cases where there are restrictions on data sharing that require that it be kept on premises. So you can build your workflow so that it can work in the cloud, but then actually is deployed to your own local servers, and you can take advantage of the logic and the scheduling and the automation of something like GitHub Actions, but you can nonetheless run something within your own firewall, keep your data always on the protected hard disk that's the one of the project. One of the other broad themes, in addition to trying to scale up complexity of projects and workflows, is managing the trade-offs between privacy, security, and the openness of the work we do and what we publish. One of the things that we have found incredibly useful for that is a thing called DMP tool, which is a data management planning process support tool. It's something that is actually advised by a lot of the funding agencies that want a data management plan. And I think most people end up backing into this type of planning as a funding requirement. But we have actually found it really good for managing the stages of a project through the point of data release and publication, and keeping everyone in the organization honest about how those things get published and where, because it's essentially a stage gating tool from the planning process of a project or a grant through the end deposition of data that will come out of it, as well as other products and software. And so we build our organizational project planning around this DMP tool, which is an excellent dashboard tool run by California Digital Libraries. And then we build on top of that a stage process where our data librarian, who's sort of our essential organizer of these components, checks in by project stage by stage, asking, what's the current condition of the data that you put into your data management plan here? When is it going to be published? Do you need help getting it published to a specific platform? What is the end date? What is the close date? What are the extension dates for that? We find that's really a key part of getting the outputs from our workflows up and published. And one of the things that we found that's extremely helpful in that process is also making sure that we have available platforms that have private and public phases in our own planning and in the way the platforms work. I actually think of GitHub as one of the best models for this, though it's not necessarily the best platform for publishing, in that it's very easy to take a project from a private state to a public state without doing a lot of work of converting from one to the other. So if you have a GitHub repository where you're developing work that is private, when there's a point in time to make it public, you can turn a switch and make your repository public from private. Some of the scientific platforms, Zenodo increasingly a little bit, also Open Science Framework, have a similar model where you can switch from private to public. So you can use the same platform for your internal work and then moving to an external public work phase. Airtable, which we'll get into a little bit, is another one of those. But there are lots of things that are sort of the little naggy parts that we have, especially when you work in areas that are not so naggy, but super important in health-related private data, as we do, about maintaining privacy as you move to the public phase of work. One of those tools that I really like a lot, which is like the little tools to maybe write down, is a thing called Git Crypt. Gitcrypt is a tool that lets you manage encryption within a Git repository so that you can have individual data files or signing keys or service API passwords or things like that encrypted within a repository so that if the repository is shared, it remains private data. You don't necessarily want to release your encrypted files. That increases their sort of like, security attack premise, but we use it because it's platform independent, and it means that as we move projects and data around, because not everyone is using Git, because not everybody is using the same platform setup, the base state of any private data is encrypted. And so when we have projects that we need to like put private data into for one reason or another, we're able to encrypt it, but nonetheless keep the code and other components that need to be shareable. So it's a tool we really like a lot for this purpose as well. I mentioned before that we have data that flows in from our field and lab teams and our collaborators sort of globally, but across different disciplines as well. And one early lesson that I learned when I was trying to sort of honestly try and impose the practices that I had learned on the organization is that there are real limits to the types of technical workflows you can ask people to do, not because they're not smart enough to do it, but because they have other things to do. The skills that one builds up as a computational researcher take a very long time to develop, and they're specialized for a certain type of work. And they're not necessarily relevant to your field veterinarian, to your bench scientist, to your policy analyst. And so you need to develop tools or have platforms that are usable from people who have different types of workflows simultaneously. And one of the big things that we found is super important in this space is having no code interfaces for data sharing and for data entry and exchange. There are two that we really like and use a lot. One is called Open Data Kit. Open Data Kit is what we use for all of our field data collection. It's a server platform that serves out surveys or field data collection forms that can be run on tablets. It runs offline. It provides a very nice offline tablet interface for people going out, be they collecting surveys, be they writing down information about field sites, be they marking down animal measurements for things that we're capturing in the field. It actually comes out originally from a humanitarian response field. It was developed by people who were doing data collection for purposes like nutrition surveys and refugee camp delineation and lots of things that occurred in very low resource environments. So it's really developed for robustness, really developed for poor connectivity, things like that. I've been told it's possibly by someone who's on this call that it's not thought of as a great data collection tool from like a commercial survey space. And so, for instance, in high connectivity environments, it might not be your pick, but it's an open source tool that can be run on your own servers. We run it on cloud compute servers. There are also a number of different platforms that are pretty affordable for selling it as a service. Then another tool that we use a great deal for this purpose, which actually does come much more out of the commercial space, is a thing called Airtable. And Airtable is an interface that has sort of a spreadsheet-like front end in the browser, but a database backend that interfaces very well with your data flow tools. We find it's much better than most survey tools for people who need to do bulk data entry. You've got 100 samples to enter their IDs in. You've got a bunch of data that's already in a grid and spreadsheet somewhere to copy and paste into it. But even though it can sort of feel like that freeing spreadsheet environment, it actually provides a common language of data because ultimately it does enforce structured data and schema for people who are entering data, and it reduces a lot of data entry issues as a result. This is something that costs quite a bit for the tool that it is. You know, it really is sold a lot to commercial enterprise clients, even though we get some nonprofit discount from it. But one of the things that I've learned is that like high quality graphic user interface is what one pays for, even in a world where I largely work on open source projects and use open source computational tools. When it comes to things that have really high end, well-developed interfaces that are not programmatic, the best versions of those tend to be commercial. I've been rambling a bit on these, so I'm going to hurry through some of them. So, because this is just a little more detail on sort of our Open Data Kit interface. So we use it for a single project might have a series of different questionnaires about work where we're looking at, you know, what's the veterinary history of animals that we're doing viral sampling from, questionnaires for their handlers. And so there's a backend that lets people preview the results, but you can also access it via API and pull it all down. There's an R package in the R OpenSci organization called RUODK that's we use every day for our workflows for accessing data from it. And then Airtable has this interface that feels very familiar to an Excel user as sort of like a tabs and tables approach, but ultimately is a structured Postgres database on the back end. And we use it for a real variety of things, be it for, you know, individual data, both entry and publishing. It's actually a great way to share data for people who are used to a more visual output of data, that want to browse through and discuss individual data records rather than getting lost in versions of things in CSVs. Having them in this sort of highly visual but raw data approach we find is very helpful. So it ends up being both a data entry tool, but sort of used in read-only mode for discussions with collaborators a lot. So this is an example where, you know, we're taking measurements from hundreds of bats in the field, and that's being punched into this database. It also gives a common database approach that's really familiar even for people who are not necessarily people who are handling data in their perspective. So for instance, our lead animal clinician, whose job it is to standardize and promote the safety and humaneness of all of our animal sampling protocols, maintains what is a highly structured database now of all of the ways we sample and capture animals. So this is a screenshot from that. Every type of animal capture mechanism we have in a structured database that he built. So if you say, we're going to use a long net, right? We have photographs of how to use the long net. We have lists of the things that, the types of species that you might capture with a long net. We have text that you would include in an animal sampling protocol or in a grant methods section if you're planning to use the long net. And then you go further to the right and it has the suppliers from which you can order the long net and how much they cost. And so this is not a person who thinks of themselves as computational or data focused, but they had a lot of structured information that they wanted to make available. And by using the same platform that our scientific data teams use, it turned out to be something that created a common data language and workflows for everybody. The other nice thing is it actually has a bit of a process automation component of itself. And similarly, in creating a common language of structured data, it helps us create a common language of structured workflows that sort of links our non-computational teams with our computational teams about thinking about what can we automate. So Airtable has sort of a GUI actions type platform for saying things like, in this case, when we have an Airtable that has our all of our scheduled dates of the scientific talks that we're going to give or be given, and it will create and you can create an automation workflow that can either link with something with code or can do things like set up invitations on other services and send reminder emails to people. Now, all of this is sort of the tooling that we put together to teams, but a lot of what we do when we think about the problems of collaboration is about our cross-training. So we have sort of a variety of mechanisms that we try to use for data science related cross-training across our organization. One of them is one that you are participating in right now, and something I've been doing for 15 years or so. I was telling Christian that I founded the Davis R users group when I started graduate school, which was in 2010. And so at our organization, we have something much like what you're doing now. We have a weekly, what we call methods and models meeting, which is where people give talks about methods, be it how to do something, how to use a tool, for brainstorming methods and having feedback sessions for in-development ideas and code. And like this is sort of a mix of internal and external collaborators. And it's not necessarily that unique a structure. Lots of organizations do it. One of the things that we have found very helpful is structuring all of that information that we produce into data as well. So there is an Airtable database that also feeds some automated workflows that includes the recordings of all of the talks that we have and a labeling mechanism about what their different topics are, the summaries and the slides associated with them. And that becomes a searchable catalog and a data resource, which is then used in our different training work. Another mechanism for cross-training across teams is we just try to have common rooms. The organization was pretty on Slack before 2020, but very much after 2020. So we have a series of common problem-solving chat rooms in our organization on Slack for different support topics. So we have general data science work, we have server troubleshooting, but again, we use the same platform for the data science and non-data science driven stuff. So there's another one about grant writing, essentially, which helps you answer questions like, do I need an IRB for this kind of study, right? Like, does anyone have an example of having this type of sampling plan? And so this is another way that we make sure that we get cross-fertilization and cross-training across the different individual lab groups. And then we have central expertise that we build in. So we're an organization, we've got 35-ish people you have as scientists. Within the data science space, we have 2 people who act as the common resources for the organization. We have an infrastructure engineer and a data librarian. Infrastructure engineers manages our compute resources, right? Being like, how do we run the big servers? Can I get a cloud service set up, a server to serve ODK within a certain region? Can I get field system testing of this thing that I'm going to set up, or training for my field teams on computational workflows? Andrew Aspira, our infrastructure engineer, is the common resource for that. We also have a data librarian whose job it is to shepherd those data management processes within organizations. And so if a project is being spun up, what the resources should be, how their data lifecycle management should work, and the support for building those common workflows is what his role is. And they live in the same space as our finance team and our virtual space, right? As our grant compliance team, the data science support is one of the sort of core organizational support mechanisms that we have. One thing they do is maintain an open handbook that we have. So this is something that you can visit. It's always in need of updating of different sort. So that serves as the knowledge repository for a lot of this information. And one of the things we really like is this is constantly maintained. And what we do is we drive the people who come in and say, present a topic at a seminar, we might say, that's a resource we could use. So can you give us 4 bullets about what that is and what the read more resources should be for that topic, and can you add it to the handbook today? And so that's a mechanism that we use for keeping it fresh and making sure that those new resources come in. And then all of those things aggregated end up as part of our onboarding document. So somebody who shows up, their supervisor will usually write up an onboarding document for them and say, these are the things that you need to know for the work you're planning to do in the next few months, right? Which is just a Google Doc that mostly is links to all of the other resources that I just described to you. So this is the Slack channel, this is the talk, this is the GitHub repository, this is the guidance for the tools that you're going to use that are in the handbook. And so those things collectively make an organizational training process that we really like. I have a few other things I can point to. One of them is sort of different mechanisms for co-creation via peer review of code in projects and co-work sessions that we like. And I can get into some of those specifics, but with the time we have left, I think I want to wrap it up there and leave a little bit of time for questions. So thank you very much, and I'd be glad to hear either what you want to ask or what you want to say. Like I said, this is sort of a new talk that I'm giving, so I'm interested in what you find most compelling or what you think there should be more or less of.
Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing. I certainly feel like there were a lot of things that I want to incorporate in my future practices, push labs that I'm involved with to move towards just really. And it was nice to see the variety of different work settings that you've been able to apply these ideas in. And I think it really, you characterized your work that you're presenting as an N of one situation. I feel like you have N of more than one, given the number of different projects you were able to share that you've been able to apply, like targets and these different workflows too. There definitely have been a couple questions in the chat that I'd love to ask on their behalf. So one that's come up a couple of times is people asking if you can share your slides. If you could share your slides, we would be happy to circulate
They will
them.
be coming. I'll send them all.
Amazing. So we'll make sure that gets out to you. One question was, what kind of data validation libraries do you use? Do you use AssertR or Point Blank or things like that?
It's a mix. The teams, we tend not to be very prescriptive about that level of the work. I tend to have recommended AssertR, partially because I'm most familiar with it. And I think within the teams, it's sort of, I mean, lots of stuff has this these days, but at the time we started doing this, it's like pipeline focus made a lot of sense for the type of things that we were doing. So that works pretty well. I will honestly say that it's not the hardest problem in the data validation workflows to impose the type of constraints that those validation libraries give. The hardest stuff is more on the cross-table component, right? It's more about linking data together. And usually the things that you don't, I mean, you have sort of a constant iteration process what you're anticipating, but it's not hard from my perspective to write in base or dplyr or other things, a thing that will error on an output or filter out the incorrect ones and post them. So we've used AssertR, but it's actually it's pretty varied. And I find that the validation libraries themselves aren't necessarily a big hurdle for people.
Thanks. One question was around, do you use GitHub Enterprise or just regular GitHub?
We don't use Enterprise. We have one, to be perfectly honest, while there are some advantages to it, we've had a very generous nonprofit plan on the professional for a long time, and it would be an enormous leap from that to enterprise for us. And so it's not something that we've really pursued or needed. That's not to say we don't consider enterprise tools. And so one of the real trade-offs you often have to make in this space as you're moving from the individual to the organizational scale is you just hit certain needs, especially with privacy and compliance, that are not available in the open source or free versions of tools. And so, for instance, for auditing related reasons, we use enterprise Airtable. GitHub tends not to be where we store the auditable data in general, but that stuff doesn't up on Airtable. And so Airtable is actually probably the most expensive thing we have over like our big servers, right, in the terms of the year-over-year cost, but we find it's worth it for those purposes. And then there are other tools where the enterprise version is essential for some of that organizational management, but we haven't hit it with GitHub yet.
Great. Thanks for sharing. I definitely feel like I've seen some of that here with, privacy concerns driving a need to move into enterprise subscriptions. Let's see. I have one of my own questions, which I'll insert here in the middle. I was wondering, with all of the work that you shared around targets, how does that tend to integrate for you if there are parts of the workflow that you just feel like you have to do outside of R?
So it's interesting. Like, we have a couple of people who are big Python bioinformatics people, and so we tend to they have sometimes a little bit of a parallel workflow and things that we trade off on, but both in things that we have built and in things that I've talked with others, especially in the bioinformatics space, it ends up being a question of just like where the majority of the work is, right? So for a project that's like 3/4 of the work is in R, I would definitely use targets. And there's a resource that I can share. A guy named Joel Nita gave a talk a while back on using targets in bioinformatics, because it's perfectly feasible to just use targets to call out to shell tools or Docker containers or Python scripts, and then bring the results or the file hashes back in. So it's a generalizable tool in terms of the workflows, but it's most advantageous if you're working in R, because you can take advantage of your R expertise to have high-level sort of manipulation of your own workflow. And so it would not be that valuable for someone who works mostly in Python or Julia or something else to code that work in R, because it's not taking advantage of where their expertise is. We're like a 80% R shop in general, and so that's why it ends up being the best tool for us.
Great, thanks. One person was asking, first of all, they were just expressing some gratitude. They were saying this is really awesome. They would like to apply this kind of thinking in their organization. Is there some support you can reference, organizations, individuals willing to assist, maybe a community for applying these workflows in organization?
I don't have a good answer for that. I wish I did. I mean, part of this is about that idea, and it's part of the reason Greg and I first had that conversation that led me to say, maybe this is what I should give a talk about at when I was invited for this. So I must admit I don't have great answers for this. I wonder about, for instance, like there's an R user group organizer community. I think some of I think there, the communities that I know of for this are very private industry driven. There are, for instance, a number, the R meetup group in New York, and some of the other sort of like data impact sharing groups is largely composed of the people who are the data science leads within a unit or an organization. Right. So often your non-university focused, like data science meetup groups often really are full of people who think about these processes, essentially. People in commercial contexts really think about these processes because people time efficiency is a big deal to them, much less than those who get produced by the sweat of graduate students. So I think that's the best place to go. I'm sorry, I don't really like have like a name for you, but it's something that I'd like to have an answer for as well.
Well, I feel like that is really helpful advice because I personally wouldn't have known to kind of think about narrowing my focus to thinking of, well, how can I go get support from industry where it's going to be more common?
You know, and the comment from Emma Starr here is actually right on. I should have mentioned it. So OpenScapes is an organization which you would call like a level of scaling up of the Carpentries model, in that it moves from a week workshop for an individual to a semester program for a team. So at OpenScapes, a whole lab signs up together to do a common training over the course of a semester. And so they have a community that are the labs doing that, and then it'll be a team of researchers and postdocs and students who are in there together learning how to do common workflows. That's started by Julie Lowndes. It's out of NC's, who's a close partner with ARP and Sci on a lot of things. And that's an excellent model for that like small research group scale.
I'll throw out one resource for this person who was asking, if it's just a little thing like with targets or something, there's also the R for Data Science Slack channel, which always seems to be able to respond to, like little questions about, I can't figure out this syntax or something like that. So that might be another resource for some of the small steps along the way. Let me see. There were a couple more questions. Yeah, so people also looking for startup references around RM and package dependency management.
There's a couple of links that I'd send you. I mean, there's good tutorials on it. Although one of the things that like RENV is an interesting, I'd say targets is like an enabling thing. RENV is an essential thing that kind of acts like a pain point you have to get over. There are a couple of tools written by a person named Miles McBain. He's actually based in Australia, who I correspond with a lot about how he works for an emergency services department, actually, and so runs data workflows for them. So he has a very sort of time intensive focus as well, and rapid project scale up approach. And he has some tools that are sort of wrappers around RN that are really helpful for smoothing out that workflow. RN can be a thing where what happens is you step into a project and you have to spend, it is forcing you to make sure that you have the same environment as someone, but that may mean that you have to go through the same half day of debugging the setup to get it just as they are. And at the end, you'll all be perfectly matched, but it can slow down that collaboration at some level. That's it. Robert punched it in. The essential tool is something called Capsule. And that's something we've started making use of a lot. There's also a great New York R meetup talk of his that's recorded on getting started with targets, and how that really enables rapid iteration and workflows.
Yeah, I'm wondering, just another personal question, we talked about, or you talked about targets and RM. I was wondering if you've experimented with Rocker and Docker and where those fit in, or if they've been excluded from the picture and what the story is there.
So, well, I'm a core maintainer of Rocker, actually.
Okay.
So I assure you,
Yeah.
we did a great deal. It is, like, it's incredibly useful. It is not always needed, and it's interesting. We use it in our organization a lot, but most people don't know that we do. So like our GitHub actions, right, which people just sort of use the templates and copy over, like all the runs are happening in Docker containers. Like it's the base level upon which things are built. People log into our high performance compute nodes and they don't know, but they are in a Rocker container doing the work, right? Like they have an RStudio interface. It looks like the computer. They have no idea that it's a container. And so I think of it as an incredibly useful thing, but it's something of an advanced topic. Most people in the organization don't need to know anything about it. And like we deploy a Shiny app, it's in a Rocker container. But I think of it as essential, but also somewhat base level infrastructure. And so it's really the realm of the infrastructure engineer for us.
I find that really cool that you've, found a way to almost enable these reproducibility practices with virtually no added effort, that people are using these tools almost without realizing them. That's really nice. There's a question in the chat about how you manage internal R packages.
We do not have any private, well, no. We used to have one, and it is actually public and always was public, but it was a specialty package for accessing internal databases. So without the keys, it wouldn't work, right? So we don't make a lot of them, honestly. It's not the highest priority. We have a few, and we largely just have them on GitHub, and we're starting to put them on our universe. But everything that's in our package is a public tool. We might be breaking a rule about like font sharing somewhere about our slide format package, but we basically just have them on GitHub. So we don't have to manage a private repository or anything like that. There are lots of options were we to do that, but it hasn't been something that's come up. The organization, we tend not to need to share. We don't need to protect code generally the way we need to protect data.
Gotcha. I've given you my questions, and I think we've asked the questions from the chat. I have some comments I can give you, so I really loved how you, I think I may have said this already, but I loved how you framed that the good enough workflow might be good enough for individuals, but might not be good enough for organizations or the organizational scale. And I thought your way of thinking about how every kind of center of work should have its own data science expertise was really nice. That felt different from the paradigm that I see so often, which is like there's a data science hub, and then there's kind of like topic hubs elsewhere and around that. And I think that's a really nice different way of thinking about that.
I would say I would not say that was how we meant that. That's a description, right? It wasn't it should do it. It's this is how the organization is, right? We would and part of it is a matter of scale. We're not big enough to have a data science hub, right? That said, we have an approach that people should have ownership of their work. And so if it all lives in some center, then we didn't feel that would make sense.
That makes sense to me. Something that I thought was a really kind of profound parallel in your talk, actually, between two different parts of your talk, was the organizational maps that you showed for targets packages, and then your people resources, your people and your expertise and skills resources. And in a way, I felt that mapping those resources, mapping those interdependencies was something that I saw as something that would really help a newcomer for any project. And that might not be like a new hire, but just somebody who's starting to work on a project, getting brought up to speed, that would really help them understand the lay of the land much more quickly. And so many times I've wanted, the kind of onboarding documents that you were showing to be as nice as what it seems like you guys have really invested in. So that really struck me as an amazing way of thinking about dependencies, organizational resources, and interdependency. So I really appreciated seeing that.
All right, thank you. That also kind of accidental. You know, the person flow chart and the targets flow chart. I hadn't thought about that, but it's worth using it, because I think like structure is something I still need to. I was sort of throwing topics at the wall here, and I think that will be useful to structure it. We're over, and I do have to go.
Sure.
Thank you all for coming again. Good to see new and old avatars and names here. So thanks everyone for attending. I will send these slides as well as a few links that I was mentioning to Christian to post on the Rub group. And so have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.
All right.